Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Scott in the UK and welcome to the 27th event in the current Zoom series, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary social and cultural debates. Today, I'm delighted to say that our guest speaker is the Reverend Dr. Richard Finn, who will be talking about Pope Leo XIII's encyclical letter of 1891 called Rerum Novarum. Father Richard is a member of the theology faculty and the classics faculty at the University of Oxford and lectures in Augustine and church history at the Hall and in the Studium, which is the seminary also run by Blackfriars, and is archivist of the English and Dominican province. He has previously served as novice master for the English Dominicans and as a governor of St Mary's University, Twickenham. He has been a member of the Las Casas Advisory Board for a number of years, but took the role of director of Institute a few years ago, a position which he still holds. His publications include Almsgiving in the later Roman Empire, Asceticism in the Greco-Roman world, and the Dominicans in the British Isles and beyond. He was also one of the two curators of the virtual exhibition, A Pipeline from Heaven, 800 Years of Dominican Books. Now, if any questions occur to you during this talk, would you please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button at the bottom of your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guest to answer, and Professor Michael Collins will join me for that discussion. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. And with that, I'm looking forward to a really fascinating talk today. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Mike. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII published Rerum Novarum, the encyclical or pastoral letter addressed to the Catholic bishops of the world. It would prove a highly significant letter at the head of what became a major tradition of papal teaching on matters of social justice. Indeed, the importance of Rerum Novarum grew over time as later pontiffs expanded upon its teaching in encyclicals often issued on an anniversary of its publication, such as Quadragesimo Anno in 1931. Now, my concern is not simply with the letter's contents or the background to its publication, but with how it changed the lives of a few of its British readers some 20 years after its first appearance, how they quarrelled over its import, and so shaped, ultimately, how the letter was received by you and I. The call of Pope Francis to cultural encounter that engages with the pressing concerns of the modern world has behind it not just the teaching of Pope Leo, but subsequent debate over its meaning. And I'm particularly interested in the role played by two Dominicans, one a friar, Father Vincent McNabb, and one a lay Dominican, Miss Emily C. Forte. So, what did Pope Leo XIII set out in Rerum Novarum? It's important to consider the different English translations. The first, entitled On the Condition of Labour, was published in the tablet on June 6, 1891. A very similar official version appeared later that year. The Jesuit, Father Eyre, published a revised translation entitled On the Condition of the Working Classes in 1895. And this influenced the version I shall quote from this afternoon with the same title and first published in 1910 by the Catholic Truth Society on behalf of the Catholic Social Guild. Pope Leo took as his starting point the recognition that the spirit of revolutionary change was not confined to politics, but was also present in practical economics, or what we might call economic affairs. Social conflict was fueled by a situation where a small number of very rich men had laid upon the teeming masses of the labouring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. Such workers had been surrendered, isolated, and helpless, surrendered to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. Sounds familiar. As the Pope later stated, how to address this plight was the pressing question of the hour. The pontiff did so by defining the relative rights and mutual duties of the rich and poor, of capital and labour. The letter then was not an abstract exposition, but addressed a social crisis. Pope Leo's teaching then falls into four principal parts. The first is a rejection of socialism, by which we now take the Pope to mean communism. This is followed, second, by a defence of private property as an individual's natural right. But the pontiff quickly sets that right within the wider context of a person's true good and destiny as revealed and enabled by the Church. Third, Pope Leo examines the proper role of the state in fostering good relations between employers and employees, before finally, in the fourth part of the letter, looking at the role of voluntary associations, including what we would call trade unions. So socialism, as Leo put it, was not the right answer to the crisis, because the abolition of private ownership was an injustice that would harm workers. The right to private property was in accordance with the law of nature. Though the earth should serve the needs of all, to own something, to have the right of using something, without fear of it being taken by others, was properly part of how we meet present needs and also secure a future for ourselves and families. Private property ensured a return for labour. As Pope Leo wrote, if one man hires out to another his strength or skill, he does so for the purpose of receiving in return what is necessary for the satisfaction of his needs. He seeks in return for the work done, accordingly, a right, full and real, not only to the remuneration, but also to the disposal of such remuneration. Socialism, so called, was also to be rejected for exaggerating the authority of the state. The natural and original right to marry and raise a family was divinely sanctioned in Genesis. This meant that the family had rights and duties peculiar to itself, which the state had no authority to encroach upon, though it had a duty to aid a family reduced to exceeding distress. Leo then opposed the Marxist view that society was divided into essentially antagonist classes, that class is naturally hostile to class. On the contrary, capital cannot do without labour, nor labour without capital. It was the role of the Church to remind all of their respective duties, and especially of the obligations of justice. That meant employers were to respect in every man his dignity and worth as a man and as a Christian, with time for his religious and other duties. The employer must not tax a person beyond their strength or capacity. Above all, wealthy owners and all masters of labour were not to profit out of the need of another or defraud people of their wages. Pope Leo insisted on the need to pay full-time workers a just wage, a so-called living wage. That is, a wage that someone could actually live on and with which they would be able to support a family. The wage shall not be less than enough to support a worker who is thrifty and upright. However, relations between rich and poor were not simply to be governed by the dictates of justice. The gospel taught the dangers of wealth, and Leo cited Aquinas on the duty of Christian charity, to share with people in need those possessions not required for oneself, one's household, or station in life. And this was not simply a matter of one's material goods, but also of the gifts of the mind. The church was uniquely placed to form people in the requisite virtues of justice and charity, and so heal the rifts within society. The social transformation witnessed in the spread of Christianity, the heroism of its charity, should now lead people to return to Christian life and Christian institutions. Christian charity, therefore, was not to be supplanted by state relief, but Pope Leo argued forcefully that the state had an important role to play in the work of remedy and relief. As you might expect, the Pope begins with the overall role of the state as enabler of the common good through its laws and institutions, but then moves to examine its duty to manual workers or labourers and the fatherly solicitude with which it should act towards them. While the rich have resources to fall back on in time of need, the poor must chiefly depend upon the assistance of the state. Well, given the damage of strike action to the Commonwealth, Pope Leo teaches that the state should obviate the need for strikes. First, from his perspective, is the right workers have to rest from labour, with time in which to worship God on Sundays and certain holy days. However, the state must also protect workers from men of greed who use human beings as mere instruments for money-making. That meant limiting the length of the working day and provision for rest periods adequate to the nature of the work in hand, and in the case of agricultural labours, suitable for the season of the year. The state should limit what length and type of work could be expected of women, but especially of children, whose education and development would be stunted by early exposure to workshops and factories. Most importantly, Pope Leo argued that the state, though it did not set wage levels, had a duty to ensure workers were paid a wage sufficient at least to support themselves. Where a man had income enough to support himself and his family, he was encouraged to save money, which could then be used to gain property. The law should favour ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the people to become owners. The virtue of such ownership would be to lessen what we may term the inequality gap, but which Leo graphically named the gulf between vast wealth and sheer poverty. The state was not to undermine this narrowing of the gap through excessive taxation of the poor. And then in the final part of the letter, Pope Leo turns to the positive role that associations of different kinds could play in the relief of suffering and in bridging the class divide, including benevolent funds and, most important of all, what the tablet translation called workmen's associations or societies, and which the 1910 translation called working men's unions, whether those of workmen alone or of workmen and employers together, and which the Pope taught should become more numerous and more efficient. Indeed, Leo quoted Aquinas to teach that the state had no authority to ban such associations unless their express purpose was hostile to wider society, nor was it to control them or confiscate their goods, as had happened, of course, to a great many religious communities in 19th century Europe. However, the pontiff condemned those unions which sought to enforce a closed shop and were hostile to Christianity, urging Christians to form their own associations and blessing those who supported them. He hoped such unions would have due regard for its members' spiritual as well as material well-being, and bring the lapsed back to the practice of the faith. The Pope ended the letter by asserting that to address the crisis, everyone should put his hand to the work which falls to his share, and promised the churches cooperation. In particular, every minister of holy religion must bring to the struggle the full energy of his mind and all his power of endurance. Now, that call would have a powerful impact on the Dominican Friar Father Vincent McNabb. But before we turn to the letter's impact, we should briefly set out its historical context. McNab himself, in an unpublished manuscript, observed that the letter was drawn up under the inspiration and advice of a group of men almost without parallel in modern churchmanship. In particular, McNab drew attention first to the writing of Bishop Wilhelm Ketteler of Mainz, whom he termed an invisible inspiration. 2 years before his being made a bishop, Ketteler had drawn on Aquinas to preach 2 sermons on property and almsgiving at Mainz in 1848. His teaching was developed in his book of 1863-1864, The Labour Question and Christianity, in which he advocated support for trade unions, which he hoped might be funded by Christian capitalists. In July 1869, he preached on the importance of better wages, shorter working hours, and the banning of child labour in factories, concerns he presented in September that year to the Bishops' Conference at Fulda. The state, he argued, had a duty to intervene and legislate in these matters. Well, Ketteler died in 1877, but the second influence identified by McNab was Cardinal Manning, who lived to read Rerum Novarum and contribute to revisions of the tablet translation before his death in 1892. He is one of the figures in creating the official translation. Manning had established a mission in 1857 for labourers building Paddington Station, and had intervened in support of workers during the London dock strike of 1889. And 2 years before that, he had published a speech, The Rights and Dignity of Labour, originally delivered at the Leeds Mechanics Institute, in which he upheld the true dignity in mere labour of the body, and asserted that every labourer has a right to work or not to work, and in which he also extolled workers' associations. I can conceive nothing more entirely in accordance with natural right and with higher jurisprudence than that those who have one common interest should unite together for the promotion of that interest. The Cardinal argued that the principle of free trade was not applicable to everything. It was limited by moral considerations, in particular the impact of long working hours on family life and on children's education. It was for the state to regulate working hours by legislation. So Pope Leo was building on earlier teachings by individual bishops. But the letter as a whole, framed as the pressing response to social conflict and issued as an encyclical to the bishops of the world, was more than the sum of its parts. It was a major step in the Church's cultural encounter with and response to Marxist thought. What then was the letter's impact? Its first British readers took it variously. A writer in the Pall Mall saw it as a magnificent confirmation from the papal chair of Cardinal Manning's doctrines, and as gall and wormwood for English Catholics of the old conservative school. However, the Manchester Guardian had commented that the Pope figures in the encyclical as a staunch conservative. The tablet criticised the former writer, while noting that the latter had the advantage of reading the original text for himself. In the Dublin Review for July 1891, Cardinal Manning stressed Leo XIII's assertion that Christian teachings and the charitable action of the Church were crucial to remedying modern ills. However, Manning also highlighted the encyclical's defense of legislation to protect the poor, its account of the liberty, duties, and cooperation of workers, and the right to a minimum wage, defined in terms of maintaining a home and family in reasonable and frugal comfort. Well, I'm especially interested in the encyclical's British readers in the early 20th century. The letter was one of the factors that directly and indirectly inspired a small group of laypeople and clerics to found between 1909 and 1910 the Catholic Social Guild, and to promote more widely what we would now call Catholic social teaching. The principal figures who either inspired or ran the guild over the next few years were the Jesuit, Father Charles Plater, the rector of the Oscott Seminary, Monsignor Henry Parkinson, who became the first president of the guild, a journalist and poor law guardian, Mrs. Virginia Crawford, who became one of the first secretaries, the author, Leslie Tope, who served as treasurer, a Birmingham priest, the Reverend Canon Villiers, a lay Dominican, Miss Emily C. Forte, Mr. G.C. King, and Mr. Thomas F. Burns, Secretary of the National Conference of Catholic Trade Unionists and a leading figure in the Catholic Federation. Both women, by the way, were already active members in the recently founded Catholic Women's League, spearheaded by Margaret Fletcher. Crawford had also encouraged Catholic women to play a more active role in the sphere of educational and social activity, and she urged them to turn to the encyclicals of Leo XIII for enlightenment. She had noted many writings on social issues published by French Catholics, and their annual publication of a Guide Social, the contributors of which were not only professional authors, but men and women of the leisured classes, who have been inspired to their apostolate mainly by the teachings of Leo XIII. The Guild was effectively established at a meeting in Manchester in 1909, where Monsignor Parkinson urged upon Catholics a careful study of the encyclical Rerum Novarum and the perusal of such literature on social subjects as we already possess. It was Parkinson who wrote an introductory analysis to the 1910 translation of the encyclical, which appeared as the Catholic Social Guild pamphlet number 3. In a paper on the aim and work of the Catholic Social Guild, delivered by Parkinson in August 1910 at the First National Catholic Congress in Leeds, he stated that it had been founded because many believed it to be a pressing need, a possible echo of the encyclical's pressing question. The subsequent press report made no mention of Rerum Novarum, but Parkinson explained that the Guild aimed at social betterment for poor and destitute Catholics, and not only Catholics. It aimed at the amelioration of society through active citizenship, rather than providing alms for individuals. The Guide Social found its English counterpart now in the Catholic Social Yearbook, the first of which appeared in 1910, with a long list of outline lectures which the Guild hoped to produce for essays and discussions in Catholic clubs. These included why Pope Leo wrote his letter on labour, the social programme of Leo XIII, and results of Pope Leo's letter on labour. Early meetings at Chelmsford and Birmingham took as their subject for discussion the defence of private property. A sermon preached by the Bishop of Northampton, Dr. Keating, on opening the new church at Norwich in December 1910, reveals the extent to which he saw the encyclical and the Guild as important elements in addressing social conflict and combating socialism. He spoke of the unrest abroad and at home. There was war, class war, in the atmosphere. There was the war of labour against capital, of poverty against wealth. And in this war, it was not merely property that was at stake, but the most sacred family relations and every form of religious belief. Catholics then should educate themselves for the discussions that would inevitably arise, and Keating recommended his hearers to dig up that buried treasure of inspired instruction upon all these matters, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, and take instruction from their clergy under the Catholic Social Guild for men and the Catholic Guild for women. Earlier that year, an article on the encyclical, a Catholic Social Catechism, signed by Felix, had appeared in The Crucible, the magazine founded and edited by Margaret Fletcher. It too advocated study of the famous letter of Pope Leo, which could be acquired from a penny from the Catholic Truth Society, and which, it asserted, had produced great results wherever it has been studied and taken to heart. It was to be studied by politicians and by employers and by working men. Indeed, the article called the encyclical the Working Man's Charter. It stated the importance of a fair wage, the wrongfulness of sweating, condemned by the Church as cruel and unjust, the need for better legal limitation on child labour, and the need for trade unions. However, although it acknowledged the existence of moderate socialists, it included the question, may a Catholic be a socialist? And gave the answer no. In similar vein, Monsignor Parkinson published in 1913 a primer of social science, a book in which he set out an outline of what he termed the facts and principles which constitute or control the activities of society with a view to social prosperity, and which furnish the means to address the social question posed by the inequalities of the different classes. We may consider it an early presentation of Catholic social teaching, inspired by Rerum Novarum, and Parkinson presented Pope Leo's able analysis of the condition of the world as a guide to contemporary affairs. Parkinson referred to socialism only twice. First, as far removed from cooperation, understood as a voluntary union of persons for the pursuit of economic and other goods on a basis of equity and equality. But second, he recognized that socialism, like cooperation, was an opposite of competition. However, he also distinguished between the Catholic social reformer, who considered the existing economic condition or system to be bad on account of its widespread abuses, and the socialist, who rejected its essential principles. Parkinson attributed to the socialist class hatred and collectivism. Now, this early approach to Rerum Novarum would be challenged over the next few years by the Dominican friar, Father Vincent McNabb. In his article, From the Convent Window, published in August 1911, McNab cited Leo's description of the yoke little better than that of slavery itself, imposed by the very rich on the teeming masses. He observed that Pope Leo had written in words strong enough almost for a socialist manifesto, thereby calling into question any partial reading of the encyclical as primarily a condemnation of socialism. 1911, or perhaps a little later, was when McNab and Emily Forte together drew up and published what he called a series of short, intelligible extracts from the Rerum Novarum. He wrote to her in June 1941 to remind her of 30 years ago and their work in the upper room in the school at Leicester. He rather thought she had the largest share in that work. He wrote of how he had since had thousands reprinted. It remained, in his view, the best series of extracts, perhaps the sole series, offered to a bewildered world. He thought children in their last year at school should learn it by heart, as they learn songs and hymns and the catechism. Now, that publication was almost certainly the leaflet headed, "Does the Catholic Church Protect Workfolk?" The extracts were not presented in the order in which they appeared in the encyclical, but were grouped thematically under 18 headings which reveal the emphases both editors wished to give in presenting the encyclical. They are in sequence: the evil, nature of the evil, the causes of poverty, the church wishes the evil to end, work makes wealth, rights must be guarded by state, the right not to be sweated, the right to live by work, the right to a living wage, the right to the full result of labor, the right of association, i.e. trade unions, the workfolk's special right to protection, bad laws are no laws, ownership is stewardship, the state can control property, what God has done, what the state must do, small owners, and the duty of the church. We can see here McNab's initial steps in reweighting the different elements of Rerum Novarum away from the defense of private property and the supposed denunciation of socialism. At much the same time, or a little later that year, on July 5th, 1913, McNab delivered an eloquent and striking address at the Fourth National Catholic Congress in Plymouth on the condition of labour. According to the Manchester Guardian, McNab emphasised the authoritative character of the encyclical and the papal declaration that the condition of working people was the pressing question of the hour. He said that he was in the habit of quoting the words of the Pope without giving his authority. The result was that he was called a socialist. The right to property meant not the right of a few men to all property, but that all men had a right to some property. The real right of property meant the right not to be sweated, the right to earn enough, not only for self, but also for the wife and family, the right to earn enough to live in reasonable comfort and sufficiency. The following January, McNab went one step further with an article for the tablet entitled Towards Social Thinking. While avowing that his thoughts on socialism were not a defense of socialism, he cited Rerum Novarum to condemn the current working of a capitalist economy. The article caused a furore in educated Catholic circles. The following edition of the tablet carried a riposte by Thomas Burns. He accused McNab of having confused Catholic social thinkers instead of guiding them. McNab replied in turn to Burns. He observed that many Catholics felt that there were forms of socialism which are not opposed to any doctrine of the Catholic Church, and might profess these forms with a quiet conscience. McNab opposed to Burns' condemnation the approval given by the Archbishop of Liverpool to the new socialism advocated by Philip Snowden as, in the prelate's words, a socialism with which we can make friends. McNab's article and this public correspondence sparked off an acrimonious debate within the Catholic Social Guild. Minutes from the Executive Committee meeting of 27 May 1914 reveal an exchange of letters on the subject between Burns and Parkinson. Burns wished the executive to deny that the term socialism is patient of a Catholic interpretation. Parkinson declared the proposal irregular and inopportune, whereupon Burns resigned from the committee. Later minutes and a letter from Virginia Crawford to Emily Forte show that either Burns himself or those who shared his views then sought to have the Guild's work condemned by the bishops. Mrs. Crawford discussed the matter with Cardinal Bourne, who insisted that Monsignor Parkinson read out a statement at the July annual meeting in which he affirmed that any alliance between the CSG and socialism was impossible. Parkinson had to continue, if we are further asked whether we believe that socialism is patient of a Catholic interpretation, our reply is that we do not consider that any genuine socialism is patient of a Catholic interpretation, no more than we consider that black is patient of being described as white. Mrs. Crawford later acknowledged to Miss Forte that the statement was a reversal by the Guild of its former attitude, and it led in turn to Miss Forte's resignation from the executive, though not from the Guild itself. It may well have been in response to these developments within the Catholic Social Guild that McNab went on to publish a great many articles in Catholic newspapers over the next few years, in which he repeatedly presented Rerum Novarum as teaching the need to redistribute wealth as a matter of justice through the provision of a living wage, as teaching the rights for workers, and as not teaching a blanket condemnation of socialism. In his unfinished commentary on the encyclical, McNab wrote how he had found it his duty to explain some of the more striking points and principles of the Rerum Novarum, and noted that what the Pope understood by socialism was community of goods, so that, quote, other forms of thought which admit private property while calling themselves socialism are not condemned by the encyclical. The topic of how to translate the encyclical and so to understand its relation to different forms of socialism remained controversial for some years. In June and July 1916, McNab and Burns argued the question in an increasingly acrimonious exchange of letters published in the tablet. McNab asked Miss Forte that July for an official French version of the encyclical, to have their exact translation of the condemnation of collectivism. He enjoined that our translation is the main doctrine of socialism. I have called this a mistranslation, but have been attacked. Father A.H. Villiers joined the tablet debate in opposition to McNab in July and August that year. He quoted the German translation. In November 1916, McNab wrote to Miss Forte how he had published in the Catholic Times parts of the Bishop of Cork's excellent address on Rerum Novarum, in which he says that not every form of socialism is condemned by Pope Leo XIII. And McNab continued how in the same number, there was a denunciation of the CSG by Mr. Burns and the National Conference of Catholic Trade Unions. Burns' ire was now directed at Mrs. Crawford, who had published a penny pamphlet for the CSG, in which McNab said she expressly puts down that not every form of socialism is condemned by the Rerum Novarum. We had that this week there is an excellent letter against Mr. Burns by Theologus. I don't know who he is. I wish he would sign his name. And McNab himself followed up with an article, the English translation of the Labour encyclical, in the Catholic Times of April 13th, 1917. And McNab now addressed himself to the Italian translation, which he rendered as the communism of goods proposed by socialism. Well, there's not time now to pursue that controversy further. The CSG continued its mission, though Monsignor Parkinson died in 1924. Finally, I want to look just briefly how Miss Emily Forte not only worked with McNab to promote a particular reading of Rerum Novarum, as we've seen, but how she also put into practice its teachings on the duty of Christian charity, to share with the needy those gifts of the mind. She was one of the first women to become a research chemist at Birmingham and Bristol universities. But in 1907, she retrained at the London School of Sociology and qualified as a sanitary inspector, before joining with a few other women in Leicester to form a small quasi-religious community of lay Dominicans. That community was unusual in that, as well as running a small school, they concerned themselves with local issues of social justice. In April 1911, Emily was elected as the Liberal candidate for the Leicester Board of Poor Law Guardians, though she later became a Labour Party member in 1913. And you might say that she became the socialist which she and McNab held acceptable within the terms of Rerum Novarum. She devoted her time and energy to the oversight of the city workhouse and its infirmary, and the city's receiving homes for children. She left the lay Dominican community in 1915 to become directrice of the Asile Saint-Monique at Havre in France, a rescue home for girls and young women seeking a way out from prostitution, one of only 2 such refuges funded by the YMCA. And McNab wrote a prayer for use in the refuge. At the end of the war, Miss Forte returned to England with a young boy she had adopted, and after spending some time in London, returned to Leicester by April 1922. That same year, probably, she rejoined the board of Poor Law Guardians. A year later, she was elected unopposed as a Leicester City Councillor, only the second woman to be elected. A daily mass goer, she continued to work tirelessly to advance the care of the poor and of women and girls in particular, until her death, while still a city councillor, some 23 years later, in 1946, now aged 80. Miss Emily C. Forte deserves to be better known and remembered for the way in which she lived out the Rerum Novarum. But that's the next task on my list, and I must stop here and thank you for your patience today.
Well, thank you, Richard, for a delightful paper, fascinating paper, full of real issues related to politics, related to society, related to the encounter between the church and between the extremes of socialism, which we call communism. I think that if anyone has any questions, please take time now to put them in under the chat button, and we'll ask them to you, Richard. I want to start really just on an anecdote, actually, because as you were talking, I suddenly remembered an argument that occurred at my own home years ago when I'm the youngest of four boys, and when one of my brothers took real offence in finding out that my father voted Conservative. And my father used to go to Mass every day. He went to communion every day of his life, except Saturdays. But every day he went. And this was horrendous, because my brother said to him that he could not be a Catholic and be a Conservative supporter. He had to be a socialist. I heard this argument starting, and I remember my mother saying, "I wouldn't go into that room if I were you." So it did come down to the laity as well, I think. But I don't know whether they knew about these debates. Tell me, you're talking about 1911, and this was starting in 1911. Some research I was doing a few years ago noted that in 1911, only 7% of the male population actually went to secondary school from primary school. Only 7% went on to primary school, and there was a debate in the House of Commons about this issue of denying really the working class from going to secondary education, and it was defeated. The proposition that it should happen was defeated, and the reason was who would do the work in the fields. And of course, what happened was that there wasn't any work done in the fields. What happened quite soon afterwards was there a lot of bloodshed in the fields through the First World War, which was an aristocratic inspired war, and we didn't get the reforms in education until 1918, and then onwards the various education acts that came after 1918. So I just wonder whether there was, within this debate, there was any kind of contact or any acknowledgement of what was happening within education and the demands about education for the lower classes.
Yes, I mean, and there are various issues, and again, McNab was very involved with the debates around these things. So one issue that he particularly was very concerned with was the fact that even those children who were going to school were often going to school hungry.
Yes.
So the St. Dominic School in the Dominican parish in London, they had breakfast clubs. We might think of that as something really quite modern, but in fact it was something that was a matter of urgency, especially during the winter months in this period. So that was the first thing. The second issue that McNab concerned himself with, and was very much a live issue for the Catholic Church in England and Wales, was to do with what was the authority of the state to determine the education that was given in schools, and which schools would receive financial support and so on. And McNab was very suspicious of claims made by the state or attempts made by the state to control education, because he saw teachers as acting essentially in loco parentis and not as acting as civil servants on behalf of the state. So it's part of that other side to McNab that was influenced very strongly by the thinker Hilaire Belloc, who had
Yeah,
published a very influential book called The Servile State,
yeah,
where he claimed that the state had overreached its authority and was reducing the proper, encroaching the proper territory and authority of families. So McNab is, to some extent, conflicted. Well, maybe not conflicted. He's clear where the state should intervene, where it wasn't intervening enough, but he was also worried that the state would intervene too far in other areas of social life. And where these things became difficult was in determining what would be the minimum age at which someone could leave school. How much compulsory education should there be? And in fact, perhaps to our surprise, McNab was very opposed to lifting the age too high because he saw that as diminishing the proper income of the family and the work of the older child in supporting the family. This is, I think, somewhere where he was on the wrong side, almost certainly. But again, where he saw it as the state as needing to be careful how it trod.
yes, yes. Mike Collins, have you got anything you want to ask?
Well, yeah, what I was thinking while you were speaking is there's probably there's a comparable story, although the dates would not coincide, of the Dorothy Day and the American Catholic worker movement with her famous the newspaper that was sold for a penny, the Catholic
Yes.
Worker. I remember I went to Fordham University in the Bronx, and we would come out of the campus, and there'd be a man or a woman standing there handing out free copies of the Catholic Worker, and of course she was condemned as a socialist. And then when I go on to think about it, there's the issue of liberation theology, when the Pope refused to allow the theologian to kiss his ring when he visited somewhere in South America. I forget the name of the man. You know, the same kind of issue of between conservative Catholicism and more liberal Catholicism continues to our own time. Just about 3 weeks ago, I was happy to see the Pope condemned the theology of D.J. Vance, the vice president, where Vance argues that one's first responsibility is to one's immediate family. That's where charity begins at home. And the Pope said, no, you've got it all wrong. Every man is our brother. And I was, and so the response of one conservative Catholic who will all dislike Francis intensely, the response of one conservative Catholic was, well, the Pope should mind his own business and take care of his own house. And it's kind of demoralizing. I think I agree with your brother, Michael, that it's hard. How can you be both conservative and still be a Catholic? But that but the problem continues. This tension in the church, which some of the kind of conservative Catholicism that seems not to recognize the what shall I say, that the needs of the poor. The Jesuits put it, now the term escapes me, the privilege that the poor in their
The
need.
preferential option?
That's it, the preferential option for the poor. Thank you. So I've done with my speech, and I can respond if you wish.
Well, I was going to point out that there's a direct connection between McNab and the Catholic worker movement.
Yeah.
So McNab's distributism, which evolved particularly to support small homesteads and return to the land, his works were avidly read by Peter Morin and by Dorothy Day. And so they assimilated some of his ideals and values and his radicalism So there's a direct link between McNab's work on Rerum Novarum and its implications, and on the genesis of the Catholic worker movement.
Yeah. My dates are not, I have no, I mean, I remember it in my own lifetime, but I would imagine the Catholic worker movement began in the 30s, but that would be just a guess. You would know that, I think.
As a historian, I'm always very careful not to quote too many dates. I always must go away and check them in a book.
Yes.
It's the stories that are so kind of key.
When I was walking around historic Philadelphia, I was ducking the dates as well.
Has there, Richard, have there ever been a papal announcement about Marxism, about Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto? Have we ever had that, or has that just been left on one side whilst the debate goes on elsewhere?
Well, I think there's lots of places where these ideas are being discussed, and some ideas are condemned, and some, I mean, the Rerum Novarum is a condemnation of Marxist theory of class war. It is a condemnation of communism understood as collectivism.
But it's never actually mentioned. Marx is never actually mentioned in it, though.
So, well, no, that Pope Leo chooses carefully not to name Marx, and it's worth pondering why that was. But it's very clear what he meant in that sense.
Yes, I understood that. Yes. I just wondered why there wasn't any specific reference.
We have a comment, Michael.
Anonymous attendees come. It says, I grew up Catholic 1960s, 1970s, and the majority of all families were strictly conservative. The Catholic schools, including the Jesuit schools, were for the elite and wealthy. There was a change at the end of the 70s when the Jesuit schools recognized the error and opened the schools more towards the middle to lower class.
I would like to object. I went to Fordham Prep, a Jesuit high school, between 1954 and 1959, and I was the son of a New York City fireman. So we were hardly elite and wealthy. And there were many other students in the school who, came from the same kind of background as I did. Maybe that was unique to New York and the Northeast Bronx, but I don't know.
I know that in England, the Dominican sisters, congregations of Dominican sisters, were actually very strongly involved in education. And what they often did was they would arrive in a town and they would open two schools, a private school for fee-paying girls, and with the money raised from that, they would open a free school for poor girls, so that the rich actually were subsidizing the work of education of the poor through the private school.
That's the way Georgetown University funds its financial aid, not entirely, but partially.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to bring it to a close there. But Richard, that was a fascinating talk and very instructive, actually, and keep people thinking. Very grateful to you.
Thank you
for giving it. My pleasure. Thank you.
On the 28th of this month, our 28th Cultural Encounters talk will be on Monday, April the 14th. That's the Monday, April the 14th at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. in the UK, when John Ford-Rescher from Georgetown University will be discussing Henry James' novel, Daisy Miller. So I hope you'll join us for that. On this Wednesday, the 9th of April at 4 p.m. UK time, 11 a.m. EST, we have another discussion in our Free Speech International Dialogues at the Crossroads series, when we'll be asking whether the Western judiciary can ever be independent. It should be a really fine discussion there, and we've got a good panel talking that through, particularly in what is happening in the world today. So that's on Wednesday, the 9th of April, 4 p.m. or 11 a.m. Can I give my thanks to Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially the Vice President, Global Affairs, Dom Panchoff. Thanks also to the Administrator at Georgetown, Mary Gordon. I'd also like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, Dominic White, the Prior, John O'Connor, the Regent, and would you believe, Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, who didn't ask me to get onto the program. He was invited onto the program. He didn't know anything about it. But Richard, thank you very much, and also thank you for the way that you have supported this this relationship with Georgetown from the start. I'd also like to thank the UK Administrator John Angus Macaulay. At home, I'd like to thank Maggie Scott for the administration she does for me. I'm Mike Scott. I'm Senior Dean and Fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Professor Mike Scott, Michael Scott, and at Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Finally, my thanks to Mike Collins for his support always on these events. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon, maybe even on Wednesday. Okay, bye-bye. Thanks, Richard. Bye-bye.